Okay, great. There's a lot there. There's obviously a lot here to talk about, so let me try and just raise a few points in response. One of the most fascinating things about incarceration in this country is that we've seen exponential increases since the 1970s, right, to the point where we've got 1% in prison. But it turns out that during the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, we used to institutionalize in mental hospitals at rates equal to our incarceration rates today. So that makes things a lot more complicated. It means that it's actually true that if you look at the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, and you include and you use a metric for aggregated institutionalization, which would be incarceration and mental hospitalization, the numbers are as big as the rates were as big then as they are now, which suggests that actually we need to think about more than just incarceration in our models, right? Not only in the United States, but also in Europe. And what's interesting about Europe and other industrialized countries is that often rates of institutionalization in mental hospitals exceed incarceration rates. Now, so what does that tell us? It tells us one thing, is that we're not dealing, that it would be too simple to just think that the end of the 20th century somehow was an explosion of neoliberalism and of this neoliberal penality. The notion of kind of marginalizing populations, a place where the government can intervene, county and public mental hospitals, institutions for what were called mental defectives, right, in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, or for mentally retarded, right? All of these institutions, all of these government interventions, right, occurred during the 20th century, and there's a longer arc here. And so I think that in Europe also we would want to look at that longer arc. Now, in terms of the story that I presented today, of course, was abbreviated. The French influence, I would argue, goes through Smith to Bentham, and then Bentham becoming actually the most important piece of the puzzle for us here in the United States. But just to say one fascinating thing about Smith in relationship to this and to the pathway. In his Glasgow lectures, so that would have been 1762 to 1764, yeah? He actually does his entire discussion of economics, of public economy, under the rubric of police. His lectures on jurisprudence are divided into 4 sections. The piece that becomes the wealth of nation is what he calls police, because that was what it was called at the time. There was, in some sense, at the time, a fully integrated notion. This is a cameralist notion of public economy and policing, right? And so what becomes interesting is how after this period, 1776, when The Wealth of Nations comes out, police is only mentioned once, but it's not used as the rubric to understand what's going on here. Of course, Bentham then picks it up. But, okay, well, there's a longer story, but that goes with Beccaria, too. But I'll leave it there. Julian.
Is this working? Good. So I see a sort of a common theme in the sort of the positive argument that each of you made, and I'm wondering if there's also a common theme in a kind of an argument that wasn't made by each of you, but which you might share. The sort of the common positive claim that I think each of you made related to a moment, a kind of a shifting, a moment in the shifting of a collective mindset about where freedom lies, so that in Christine's presentation, the sort of the transition from coin to paper money also represented a transition from property to a kind of a contract realm in which what we were trying, what the economy recognized was a kind of an aggregation of people's preferences, an aggregation of people's freely chosen paths, a kind of a sphere in which there was this more, a kind of a place in which freedom was more enabled. And I think, Bernard, you more explicitly in your paper talked about this, you know, the idea of the of the kind of, you know, we imagine freedom, where maybe freedom doesn't actually exist so much, but we imagine the market realm as a realm of freedom. So I think you both either implicitly or explicitly share that idea. And I'm wondering if there might be a converse theme that's implicit in your presentations, and that is also a shift away from trust in government. So that in Chris's presentation, part of what happened when we moved from coin to paper note was that the public needed contract as a mechanism of protection from the potential untrustworthiness of government. That there needed to be a kind of a guarantee. And in Bernard's conception, you know, the government is only enabled to come in where there's deviance, that otherwise, in the realm of freedom, we don't want the government messing with us. The government can be trusted only where people are deviating from the rules of the free game. So I'm wondering about that, about whether there's something that we ought to be paying attention to is kind of evolving notions of trust in the state, evolving notions of the relationship between market ideology, the free market mindset, and not just ideas about positive freedom, but also negative ideas about the untrustworthiness of the state.
It's a great comment. I want to, I think, bounce off it in the following way. Part of what I thought was an interesting difference between our presentations, although I'm not sure we're incompatible on this score, was Bernard's emphasis on ideology, which is actually not an emphasis that I was, so your word mindset. It's true that I was saying legal practices lead to different assumptions, but I wasn't hanging as much on an ideology and its effects. Instead, the point that I was trying to make, which I doubt Bernard would disagree with, but wasn't an emphasis in his presentation, was that the mode in which we arrange, we design regulation, money, markets matters, right? That has certain implications. And so, so that money can work, there can be different kinds of monies that work, just as there can be different kinds of penal laws that work. But the mode in which they occur, the practice of regulation, we should look at the practice of regulation, right? Sort of, we could do a sociology of regulation and see what messages it was implying. And that's not quite the same as saying there's an ideology